Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Ecclesiastes Class. For those of you joining us at home, welcome. We pray the Lord is with you this beautiful Sunday or whatever day it is that you're watching this. We pray God is in your life and that He's working in your hearts. We are studying the book of Ecclesiastes, and we are currently in class number 6. And we're going to do chapter 4 today of Ecclesiastes. And this is where Solomon is talking about really 3 different subjects: oppression, toil, and friends, having other people in your lives. So let's, with no further ado, let me get into verse 1 of chapter 4. If you're at home, if you're here in the class, you have your notes. If you're at home, you don't have your notes, but you have your Bible. So please open to Ecclesiastes chapter 4. This is Solomon speaking, and he says, "Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter." So let's refresh what we mean by under the sun. You have the earth here and the sun up in the sky. Under the sun is a term that he uses, I think it's 39 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And what it means is earthly wisdom. That's what he means by under the sun, earthly wisdom. So using earthly wisdom, we look at it a certain way. That's the way human beings look at it here on earth, is earthly wisdom. But there's a different kind of wisdom. It's the wisdom that is above the sun. And a few times he talks about above the sun, or he talks about up in the heavens. And that is heavenly wisdom. And that is a complete different wisdom. And as we see, Solomon has great earthly wisdom, but his heavenly wisdom is really pretty poor. So God gave him a great gift of earthly wisdom, but he's lacking a little in heavenly wisdom. So what he says here in verse number 1 is he sees all the oppression that's going on around the world. And we see all that everywhere. We saw a ton of it in Egypt, of just oppression, of just the people live lives over there that are so different from ours. We went for a ride one day with a young boy in a cart, with a young boy who talked about how horrible inflation is over there. And we talk about inflation here and how bad it's been in the last few years, but it's like 60% a year over there. I mean, inflation, he was talking about how his father came along and talked to us for a while in there too, and he was talking about the price of beef and the price of chicken, which are the 2 staples of their diet over there, and how much it's gone up in the last year. And they weigh it in kilos. You go and buy a kilo of chicken or a kilo of beef, and the prices are up like 60% in the last year. And these are people that are poor, that are earning their money by putting people on carts and pulling them around town. It's just, things are a whole different in the third world, as some of us know, and some of us have now learned more about as we've seen this. So Solomon appears to have a heart for the oppressed, which is pretty rare in people that are in power. Most people that get to the pinnacle of power kind of forget about the oppressions that are affecting the common people down there, and they kind of, are more into their court and the people that are around them and their elites that are around them, and they kind of forget about the common people. But it sounds like Solomon didn't completely forget about the common people. It sounds like he cares about them from this verse. He says, "I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun." So here on earth, there is tons of oppression. There's no oppression up here, but there's tons of oppression down here on earth. Why is that? And the answer, of course, is human sin. Human sin is what brings us to oppress each other. Human sin is the cause of one human being oppressing another. Oppression is done by one person against another. And I was thinking of all the different types of oppression that exist, and some things I was thinking about was people who are slaves and have masters that mistreat them, or people who are servants and have masters that mistreat them, or people who are laborers or employees, and they have employers who mistreat them, or debtors who owe money and they have creditors that mistreat them, or creditors who are owed money and they have debtors that won't pay them. We don't think of that as oppression, but it kind of is too. Tenants who are defrauded by their landlords. We see that a lot. Or landlords who are defrauded by their tenants. Either of those are oppressions. Those are oppressors, or those are oppressed peoples as well. Probably the one we think about the most is orphans who are mistreated by guardians who are treacherous. We hear so many stories about guardians and, people who take in children but don't really love those children. That was apparently a huge problem in those days. Maybe it's a little less so today because we have some more guardrails up today than we had in those days, but it's still a problem today in our world. Orphans that are mistreated by guardians. Subjects who are oppressed by their kings or their princes. The king thinks he can do anything, right? He's the king, right? He's given power by God. He can do anything he wants to. Well, we see that. And we see some of that carries over to the people who run our governments today. We see governments who think they can do whatever they want. People who lead governments think they can do whatever they want because they're in charge. They're the boss. They're leading our government. We see victims who go into courts looking for redress and they're mistreated by corrupt judges. We see this year we've probably seen more corruption in our courts than we have in many years. We see courts that are corrupt even in our country, but certainly in other places around the world where you go into court and the judgment's already really made before you go in as to what's going on. So Solomon understood that all of this was oppression. People are oppressed in our world by other people who have more power than they have, or have more money, or have more influence, or whatever. As I said, most kings don't care that much about that. They are more on the oppressor side of the equation than they are on sympathizing with the oppressed. But it sounds like Solomon really did care for the oppressed, which is good. That means that God's wisdom made some impact on him in that department. So he's talking about the oppressed people, and he's some of the people who do the oppression could fix this if they wanted to. They could fix the problems they've created with the people that they're oppressing, but they choose not to. They choose to just keep right on going, making more money and getting more power and all of that. So Solomon had a sense for this, and he understood this. He found that many people hold the poor down with a strong hand. They just keep the poor down in order to build themselves up and make themselves richer and richer and wealthier, and stronger and stronger. And that's not totally gone from our society today either. We see that today in our society. And the poor people really have no one to make it right for them. We have a few more guardrails in our system today than they had back in those days, but we have some of that today in our system as well. And it was tremendous in that system. It was really almost a jungle kind of environment back then. He says, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. So nobody would comfort them. They were oppressed, and nobody would comfort them. Power was on the side of their oppressors. And then he repeats it, and they have no comforter. So he understood that part of the problem with the world, the part of oppression that is going on in our world today. Now let me continue on in verses 2 and 3. I'll read those to you and then we'll talk about them. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has never seen the evil that is done under the sun. So he's talking here about the evil that is done on earth under the sun by one human being against another. The sinful behavior of one human being toward another that's done here on earth. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about how that is so pervasive here on earth that now he makes a jump. He says, well, you're better off dead than alive. I don't know how many Christians would agree with that. Hopefully nobody. Hopefully nobody in this room. But he's basically saying that oppression can be so bad that you might be better off dead than alive. He's missing something that we understand as Christians. He's missing something that the fact that we are alive means that we have the ability to give glory to God with our lives. And that right there is something that is a very meaningful reason to be alive. And when you're dead, you don't have that anymore. At least not in this life, you don't have that anymore. So he's missing that. He's missing the fact that when he says, I declare that the dead who have already died are happier than the living who are still alive, he's basically saying you're better off dead than alive if you're oppressed. And I hope most Christians don't agree with that, but there's certainly a lot of people in our world who do. I mean, you look at the people that are hooked on drugs and have all sorts of things going on in their lives that are leading them in a bad direction, and many of them probably think that way. And a lot of the people we run into in this world probably think this way. But our job as Christians is to represent Christ to them. Our job is to let them know that there's a better purpose to our lives, a purpose that they don't understand. He says, but better than both is the one who was never born, who has never seen the evil that is done under the sun. Now that really takes it to even a new low. That says, not only are people better off, he thinks not only are people better off dead than alive if they're oppressed, but they're better off to have never been born. Now, Solomon didn't have the New Testament to work with. He didn't have Christ. He didn't have that peace that we have today. But as Christians, we know how false that is. We know that when God chooses to create us, to put us in this world, to give us life, that gives our lives a meaning to Him. We have meaning to Him with our lives, of a way to glorify Him with our lives. Number one, here we can do that. But number two, it gives us a way to be able to make a decision for Him, a decision that allows us to be with Him forever. And if we're never born, we don't have that decision. So he's completely wrong on this one. But this was the logic that he was using. Again, he's using this under-the-sun logic. He doesn't understand the wisdom that is up here, the wisdom that Jesus taught us when He was here on earth. That wasn't present at His point yet in the Old Testament. The wisdom that there's another life that's coming, and that the only way you get to that other life is if you're born into this one to begin with. So to say to have never been born is just really pretty awful. Questions on that before we move on? So let's move on to verse 4 through 6 next. And I saw that all the toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Well, again, I hope as Christians we don't agree with this. He said, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. So he's thinking about the Bible possibly here. He's thinking about Cain and Abel, that Cain, Abel went out and toiled in the fields, and Cain envied him for that and killed him. Or maybe he's thinking about Jacob and Esau, that Jacob was loyal to his father and loyal to his faith and loyal to God and worked with the sheep all the time, while Esau was out hunting animals and doing stuff, and Esau was jealous of Jacob because Jacob got the family's heritage, which was Judaism. Or perhaps we're thinking about Saul and Saul's envy of David, right? Here Saul was the king. And this little guy, David, ends up taking over from him. This David was blessed by God. And Saul greatly envied David. So maybe he's thinking about things like that. And Saul, of course, wasn't that far removed from him. Saul was his grandfather. Saul was his father's king, not his grandfather. But maybe he's thinking of that. But he thinks that all toil and all achievement come from one person's envy of another. I hope we don't believe in that. I hope we believe that the reason we toil, the reason we work in this world is to bring glory to God and to bring other people to God and to bring ourselves to God. That's the reason we do work, the reason we do toil. It's not envy and it's not oppression. He goes on to say this is meaningless, which would be true if that were the case. And in his thinking, that was the case. It's hard to believe this was the wisest man that God ever created, isn't it, as you read some of this stuff. Then he goes on to say, fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. So fools just kind of sit there and don't go work. Don't work. Why work? If work is just such an evil, why do the work? Why not just sit around and ask for people to give us money, right? We see some of that in our lives. We see some of that in our worlds today. Why do that? Fools do that, and he understands the fact that the people who don't work are fools, but he doesn't really understand why the people who do work actually do work. And he says, better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. So what he means by one handful is, if you sit around and just are tranquil and just have tranquility in your life and sit around and do nothing, then you're going to get less in life, one handful, than if you work hard and you work, and then you'll get two handfuls. You'll get a complete amount. So he sees that, let me read that again. Better one handful with tranquility. So he thinks that a person who just sits around and doesn't work at all and gets half of what he needs or half of what he wants, but gets enough to just stay alive and get by, is better off than a person who does work and who does go out there every day and work in the fields and plant and do all that other stuff. So he's thinking that that makes sense. Again, I hope we don't believe that. I hope we think most of us have worked for livings or work for livings today, and I hope we believe that what we do for a living is worthwhile, that it's something that's doing something besides just frustrating us because other people aren't doing it. So in verse 7 through 8, he says, again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? He's starting to get it a little bit here, right? He's saying he sees something meaningless, and the meaninglessness that he's talking about is people who just chase after work for the sake of building up money. So he's saying there's a man who's all alone. So he's saying this man isn't supporting, it's not like he needs the money to support his family. He's all alone. He has neither a son nor a brother, so he has no family. There's no end to his toil. So he just works and works and works and works and works and works and works. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. There's the key, right? This is not a person who's doing this because he needs to, he needs the money to be able to do something, to take care of his family or to give it away to people who need it or whatever. He's doing it because he wants more. He wants more wealth. He's doing it because his eyes are telling him, I want more. I see this and I want it. I see that and I want it. That's greed, right? That's what we understand as greed. So he's talking about many of the rich people that we see in our world who just want more, 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 more. I'm always amazed when they interview a rich person and they ask the key question, how much is enough? And it's always the same answer, more. Very many rich people. There are lots of great rich people, by the way, who give their money away. We've known some we came out of Grand Rapids where there was some very people who really gave, some very Christian people who gave their money away, huge amounts of money they gave away. They had successful businesses and gave it away. I actually called up there on the people who own Gordon's Foods. That would be a perfect example of a family that has taken the immense wealth they've made over a long period of time and given huge amounts of it away for great charitable needs and for God's purposes. Not making a commercial for the Gordon's Foods, but we see that in other places too. So we're talking about a man who's all alone and who has nobody else in his life. There's no end to his toil, yet his eyes are not content. That's the key. His eyes are looking, and his eyes are looking in a way where they want more. They just want something they don't have, which is more. They want more, 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 more. He says, for whom am I toiling, he asked. Why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? And that's an interesting point. One of the things we all have to learn in life is you have to get a balance between work and enjoyment. And all of us struggle with that at various times in our lives. There are times when the boss is saying, you got to do more hours and do this and that and the other thing, and we're saying, what about my family, right? So we all have to struggle with that as we go through life, and Solomon understands that. But he's saying that some of these people who are just so intent on getting more money should be asking themselves, why am I not using that money for something? either for my family or for some enjoyment of some sort or some rest. Why am I not using that? And he goes on to say, this too is meaningless, a miserable business. Questions on any of this so far? So now we get to verses 9 through 12, and I'll read you 9 through 12. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. And if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. There's a bunch of stuff in there of how we need other people in our lives, right? God created us to be in community with other people. He wants us to be in community with other people and to work with each other, to work for his glory, but to work with each other for his glory. So he says 2 are better than 1. And I think most of us know that. It's, I was trying to put on, I've got this wristband, by the way, that I got over there, which has my name written in hieroglyphics. This is Robert in hieroglyphics, if you're interested in that. Some of us got these wristbands over there. And I can't put it on without, I practically need Deb's help to put it on because it just doesn't quite snap correctly. And there's something as simple as that, right? 2 people make that job so much easier than 1 person. And there are so many jobs in life that when we have an extra set of hands, the job is just so much easier to do when we have that. And Solomon understood that. 2 are better than 1. They have a good return for their labor. So 2 people can be so much more efficient than 1 if they work together as a team. And that's obviously essential. If they work in contravention of each other, then that doesn't work. But if they work together as a team, 2 people will get more out of their labor than 1 person would ever get. Deb's showing off hers back there as well. We have them, and we bought these for our grandchildren as well. So our grandchildren have their little bracelets that have their names in hieroglyphics. We learned a lot about hieroglyphics in there. You go through these tombs, and there are walls and walls and walls and walls and walls of hieroglyphics written on them. And luckily, we had a tour guide who knows hieroglyphics and could read all of it. So he was actually in the antiquities department there at one point. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. There's the other piece, right? I've been wanting to get a bunch of heavy furniture off my porch for about 2 weeks, and I can't get it off the porch because I'm not as strong as I used to be when I was younger. So my son-in-law is coming over today to help me carry the furniture off the porch, right? It'll be a 5-minute job with him and me together. With me together, I'd probably kill myself and never get it off the porch. So there's a perfect example of that I'm experiencing right now at the moment. If either of them falls down, one can help the other one get up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. So if you fall out there, and we see this a lot with elderly people that are living alone. We've had some of it with some of our elderly relatives as they've aged and they've lived alone and they fall and it's just a major problem. If you fall and there's no one there to help you up and you need help, that's a major problem. Having a second person is so good in those situations. And if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. Well, the more people you have together in a building, the warmer it gets in that building, assuming you have no heat. And the same thing's true. In times, people have to share sleeping bags if it just gets ridiculously cold outside and they're out someplace where it's very, very cold. But how can one keep warm alone? Well, one can keep warm only to the level that your body has enough heat to do that. If you're in your sleeping bag, you can do that if you're outdoors. But 2 people can keep warm to a better extent. They can share the warmth, and the 2 of them sharing the warmth allow them to endure a deeper level of cold. Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. How many times in the movies do we see the scene where the 2 heroes turn their back to each other, and one guy fights the swords this way, and the other guy fights the swords that way, and each one's backing each other up. So the bad guys have to come at them this way rather than coming around behind them, right? So 2 people can defend themselves better than 1 can. That's pretty obvious. So there's another reason that we need people in our lives. So Solomon is kind of saying we need other people in our lives. We all know that, right? We need friends. We need people that will be there for us in our lives. Then he goes on with one of my favorite lines here. He says, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. I'll tell you an interesting story. Back when I was a Boy Scout in 1962, this is going to date me a bit, we took 3 strands of rope. And they were maybe a centimeter, like that, a centimeter in diameter. And if you nail 2 of them down, or 2 ends down, and stand on one strand, you'll break right through it in a minute. Just with the weight of a child will be enough to do that. But if you take them and strand them together and form a rope of 3 strands, we were able to build a bridge over the lake at our camp and put an entire troop of Boy Scouts on that bridge walking across it, and it supported the weight of all of us. It's amazing how when you take 3 strands of rope and put them together, 3 strands of just 1 centimeter rope, the rope's like 1 inch in diameter, you can support that much weight on it. It's amazing how 3 strands of cord, if they're put together properly, are very, very hard to break. And that's part of his thing here, that we can work together as people in such a way that we do more than just we do more than just double the value of what's coming out. We can make it many times more valuable than putting, if we just hung 3 strands of rope across and stepped on it, it wouldn't work. It would break pretty easily. But if we bind them together and into one rope, it can support huge amounts of weight. I learned that lesson as a Boy Scout, but it is true. And when we work together, if we work together correctly, we can do so much more than we can as individuals. We all know that. We all understand the value of a team. Any of us that have played on a team know that a team can do stuff because we all have different skills. One guy can play first base but can't pitch. Another guy can catch but can't play center field, and so on. We all know that we have different skills, and if we use them together, we can be very, very powerful together. Let me move on now to verse 13 through 16. Now Solomon, well, let me read it to you first. This one's a little difficult to understand. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Now, tons of stuff has been written about this over the years as to who this might be. Is he talking about the relationship here between Saul and David? There are books that have been written about that. Maybe this is about that relationship. Is he talking about the relationship between David and him, his father, and him, Solomon? Or is he talking about the relation that's yet to come between Solomon and his pretty worthless son, Rehoboam? So which of those 3 is he talking about here, if any? And what does it mean? So let's kind of go through it. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. So young people can be very wise, much more wise than we think they are. Young people sometimes are able to think through problems in ways that those of us that are much older don't think through because we don't have that same way of looking at things. My 6-year-old granddaughter can run circles around me in certain types of technology, for example. We get Facebook or FaceTime calls from her all the time where she'll tie us in with people in England and people other places around the world. So amazing how kids can be with that. But the point is, young people sometimes can figure out things that old people cannot. That's the first piece. Second thing is that the king isn't always the wisest person. Many times he isn't the wisest person. We see that a lot with government. We see that a lot in our time, that the person who's running our kingdom, our government, may not always be the wisest person. So kings can sometimes be foolish, especially if they don't get good advice from people around them who should know better, and they choose people to be around them who are sycophants, people who just want to tell them what they want to hear. Kings can be pretty foolish, and the history of kings is huge with foolish kings. Unfortunately, because kings tend to come from genetics, from family down the family tree, a lot of times people end up being kings who just are not wise and are not smart or not foolish, and so on. A foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. So a lot of times people who are in power don't see the warning signs. They just blow right through the stop sign thinking that things are going to get out of their way. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes things happen in this world that kings, the people who think they're wise as kings, don't understand and they don't appreciate. And that can take them by surprise and take them down. It says the youth may have come from prison to the kingship. Now that's the part that makes you think maybe this is David that we're talking about here, and David and Saul, that relationship. Or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom, which again might make you think about David. But the key is that sometimes people who are born in poverty and are not born in royal families are smarter and wiser and better leaders than people who are born in royal families and are born to be kings and are expected from day one to be kings someday. And he understood that, and he saw that in his own family, in his own family history. He saw it from between Saul and David. He saw it with his own succession. Remember that his mother was the 8th wife of King David, and he was the 4th son of the 8th wife of David. So there were obviously tons of other sons above him. The Bible mentions, I think, 14 other sons that David had, and there are probably more than that. And yet Solomon was chosen to be king. So it's not always the person. It's not always the person that you think of who's going to be king. Like today, it's always the firstborn son. Like King Charles is the firstborn son of Queen Elizabeth, and so on. That doesn't always get you the best rulers. I don't mean anything negative about King Charles with that, but it doesn't always get you the best rulers that way. Or he may be thinking about his own son that he's chosen, Rehoboam, to replace him, and that Rehoboam will turn out to be a terrible leader. And he may already know that. Maybe he knows that by this point in his life, but maybe he's already committed to that. He says, I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. So leadership is what causes people to follow you. And people will follow a leader who isn't necessarily the king. We've seen that many times in history. He will see that in the next generation, when most of the people actually didn't follow Rehoboam, the king. They followed Jeroboam, who was a leader. He was a military leader. Jeroboam ended up, between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, they split the kingdom in half, and it never came back together again until 1948. So it took thousands of years to come back together again. But people followed Jeroboam because he was a leader, rather than Rehoboam, who didn't have the leadership skills to lead his country at that time. So he knows that people will follow the youth, will follow somebody who's young but who's a leader, rather than somebody who's older and who's the chosen successor of the king. And he goes on to say there was no end to all the people who were before them. So again, he's back to this idea that generations come and generations go, and that we've had generations that beget more generations, and sons of fathers, of grandfathers, of great-grandfathers, and so on. He's looking at this idea again. There's no end to all the people that come from their line, but coming from the line of the king doesn't necessarily make you a great king someday yourself. You may not be a great king. It may be somebody else in your kingdom who's a better leader than you, and David is a perfect example of that. David would be a very good example of that, because Saul had sons, but they were not people that should have been leading, and Saul shouldn't have been leading. But David was the leader that should have been there. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. Now maybe he's back to Jeroboam again. Jeroboam was certainly not pleased with Rehoboam. Rehoboam was his successor, Solomon's successor, and Jeroboam was certainly not pleased with him, and 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were not pleased with him. They revolted against him because he was just not a smart man. He made huge mistakes in how he did it. He was a fool. He was foolish. And then he goes on to say, this too is meaningless in chasing after the wind. So I don't want to overplay the idea that this may be related to those 3 generations of leadership in Israel, but I wanted to let you know that there are lots of books out there that say that they think it is. And it may or may not be. He may just be talking generically here about foolish kings and smart people within their kingdom who are smarter than the king. It's possible that that's what he's talking about, or it's possible he's talking about his own family. We don't really know. I'm not going to take a position one way or the other on that. But you will see, if you research this particular passage, you will see lots of writing out there on the subject of the various family members. So that's all I really have for today on this. Any questions on this before we move on? So we have 3 of us here in the class that came out of the trip last week. Yes. Oh, yeah, go ahead and show us off. This part doesn't need to go out online since we'll probably be talking about